Okay, why don't we begin? Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our community conversation, Resilience Fatigue, Thriving versus Surviving. And again, happy social work to all of you who are joining us. And thank you for everything you do for your clients, for the community, and all the work you all do year round. It's so appreciated. And we here at NASW see the work that you're doing and are greatly appreciative of everything you do. So we are here today with our presenter, Jamie Nappi, LCSW. Jamie is a specialist professor in the School of Social Work at Monmouth University, and she owns a private practice with trauma as well as other areas. And Jamie's going to be leading our discussion today. Before we begin, just a of housekeeping measures. As I noted a few moments ago, we are recording today's webinar and be available on our YouTube page for reference afterwards and for you to share with others that you think may be interested. We'll also send a link to that recording out with a copy of Jamie's slides to everybody after today's presentation. Please remember that this is a public webinar and that it is being recorded, that the chat is public, and we ask that you just maintain a sense of professionalism on the call, avoid any foul language or any self-marketing or anything like that in the chat. But otherwise, we anticipate that this will be a robust and interesting discussion. So with that, I would like to turn things over to Jamie.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jamie Nappi, and I just wanted to do this conversation based on some themes coming up over pandemic, really, and in terms of social work and impact on our clients as well as us. I'm really just concerned about people who are considered essential as well, being able to have awareness of resilience fatigue, how it's impacting our clients as well as ourselves. So I thank you for coming and listening today, and hopefully, you'll leave with some things just to think about. I'm going to go over some basic things that have come to mind around this, and then I'm going to ask some questions throughout the presentation as well. But like Jeff said, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. So, oops, my PowerPoint is going a little awry. It's quicker than I thought. So just some working definitions. This is the APA's definition on resilience: the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant source of stress. And also the idea, a general working idea is the ability to bend, but not break, bounce back, and even grow through adverse experiences. And we rely a lot on the concept of resilience, to inspire hope. And they're not necessarily synonymous at this point, because I think it's wearing, like the idea of just working on the idea that we'll bounce back is really wearing thin, and people are really fatigued by that concept without a process. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the process as well today. In terms of just maintaining awareness about that fatigue, because that's actually a protective factor, because I think what's happening is it's leading a lot to like states of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And then that impacts hope, which is directly connected to resilience, but not synonymous with. And I want to be really careful at the onset of this, just to mention the idea of spiritual bypassing. And spiritual bypassing is not a good thing, because what it does is it fails to validate or acknowledge the things that even lead to the traumas, adversity, and tragedy that we're talking about. So I want to be really clear that I have no intentions of spiritual bypassing, because this is a process. It's not an event. It's not a state of mind. It's actually a daily practice is to check in terms of our essence of resilience, if it's there, or if it's being tried even further, or if we feel kind of like, we've taken 10 steps back in terms of thriving, because I think a lot of people currently right now are working under the premise of survival. And there's a lot of ambient kind of states of trauma happening right now for various reasons, one being pandemic and one being more global issues, and then some issues of systemic violence and structural things that are coming very much to light that are impacting people on a daily basis. So we'll be looking at some of that stuff as this goes. So in terms of resilience fatigue, Dr. Vail Wright, who's clinical psychologist at APA, has also defined it as a feeling of exhaustion that comes from the effort to cope and manage prolonged stress over a period of time, like a longer period of time. And pandemic certainly is one of the conditions that is occurring right now that is definitely enduring over a longer period of time than we really expected. Oops. Okay, so resilience fatigue, the phenomenon called resilience fatigue, which is the exhaustion that comes after a prolonged period of having to stay motivated or positive. Okay, so if you look at the picture, this is someone pushing a large object uphill. And a lot of times when I'm talking to people in terms of resilience fatigue, I actually, use the analogy of something like that or swimming upstream, which really, and what's being impacted is really our central nervous system, and it's hard to stay motivated and positive when our central nervous system is being impacted, and we might be going into this state of fight or flight or freeze for longer periods of time and having difficulty grounding and resetting and going back to baseline, and that definitely affects us. And as like social workers and other human service workers, because I don't want to leave them out, or healthcare providers, we're all being impacted by the idea, that we need to maintain a certain level of baseline so we can be in a position to help people while we're being impacted just the same simultaneously. So a little bit about like the enduring nature of what's been happening, at least over COVID-19, the pandemic. The unhappiness people feel now is different from the unhappinesses of a couple of years ago. We're going on year 3, and the intense fear and anger have waned. So like that autonomic kind of stress reactivity has kind of waned and gone more into like hypoarousal, where people are, might be feeling more dejected or sad, and that it's more like a whiplash. And when we think about resilience, it's when we think about the idea of bouncing back, really it means that we've gone through something. The problem is if you keep going through it. And there's certainly other circumstances besides pandemic where people keep going through it. As I mentioned, things like structural violence and systemic problems like racism and a lot of the impact going on today that's really in the media on a daily basis, and people are being flooded with stuff that's been going on for a very long time, but really coming to a head, mostly because people have video cameras in their pockets. And so there's a lot of like ambient kind of trauma going on as well that leads to maybe sometimes people shutting down around it and becoming more hyper-aroused. Okay, so another working definition here is that it's a process, right? Resilience is a process. So like I said, it's not a single event. It's not something that just happened. It's a process to harness resources to sustain well-being. Dr. Catherine Painter-Brick, an anthropologist, said this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the resources look like and get some feedback from you all, and then also about what sustainability of well-being might look like. So let's go to the next slide. And what comes to mind when we say resources, because depending on that kind of outlook, it's a process where we're looking for resources, we're actively utilizing resources, which will lead to hopefully a sustainable form of resilience. So if you can type in the chat what comes to mind when we say resources. So we're really looking at what we're actually talking about, because we can't harness something we can't name.
Do you need me to read off what's in the chat, Jamie? Or
no, I'll pull it up.
Okay.
I'm going to look at it. Okay, good. So mental health services, food, accessibility, social connections. That's it. We got 3. Any other resources? Okay, housing. Okay. Yeah, spiritual connections. Help being accessible, yeah, available, financial resources, employment, mhm, practical activity strategies, rental assistance, access to medical care. Thank you. Okay, all right. So some human rights and social justice types of issues coming up in the chat for sure. And accessibility isn't always a guarantee in terms of equitable access to those things, you know. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about later is the idea that when we're talking about resilience, it really has to do with interdependence, you know, and interdependence is not a new concept. You know, it's just one we struggle with because of the way that our systems are set up, particularly in the United States of America, but I'm also talking globally because we're interconnected with everyone on the planet, you know, and that really impacts that in terms of like people's ideology. It really thwarts progress towards this. And some of what we're experiencing during this time is the polarization of politics, and it's just not here in the United States, it's abroad. There's a lot of polarization that really thwarts people being able to ground themselves and really organize and impact resilience in a way where it will be sustainable. So let's look at the next slide because I want to kind of also give us some thoughts to leave with around sustainability. So what kinds of words come to mind when you consider sustained well-being? If you could type some of that in the chat box. Words, concepts, whatever comes to mind around that sustained well-being, what that might look like or feel like. Thank you. Okay, self-care, managing stressor, calm nervous system. Okay, feeling at equilibrium, more spiritual connections, yeah. Being available for others fully. Okay. Positive outlet. Okay. Feeling able to recharge. Okay. Yeah, we're going to talk about that, about how, you know, multitasking and everything else that we have to do. Okay. So which leads me to, you know, the idea that of essential, you know, we heard about essential workers, you know, for the past 3 years, and people want to thank the essential workers, and you know that's everybody who keeps it going. If you were to like sit down and even eat some food today, you might think of like all the efforts that brought you that food, you know, you know, and you might think about, you know, the people who drive the trucks and the farmers and you know everybody that makes it possible for that to get to you, the labor, you know, the technology, the energy required, you know, the dedication, everything. And that brings us to like an idea of relating to or constituting the essence of something, the essence, the individual, the real ultimate nature of a thing, and the utmost importance. And as a people, since we're so busy all the time, sometimes we barely know we're eating. If we're using that example, we barely even know we've eaten, you know. We might be doing a bunch of other things while we're eating and we haven't even paid attention to that, let alone really tracked where that comes from, you know. And essential is more about that, you know. And when we're essential, you know, we are of utmost importance and we're checking in with that. And if we're essential workers, you know, moving back to that example, you know, then we don't have the ability to check in, then we certainly don't have the ability to fully be available to others, as was noted in the chat box that somebody noted, you know, the idea of us being fully available to make things sustainable. because we need to replenish. And somebody also reached for that as well. And this isn't just fluff. I mean, self-care is actually, a concept that's very, very old in terms of like replenishing energies, that make us give an offering out to others, that like help us prepare to do that, and I don't think that the way that people are like flying by the seat of their pants under like pandemic and everything else that's coming out because the lack of sustainable resources, that we're really able to tap in to what we need to do, to maintain at this rate, and also be present for ourselves. Okay. So being essential. So if we're still talking about that, more than 54% essential workers have identified during this time that they're relating on unhealthy habits to get through pandemic, suffering unwanted weight changes, sleep disturbance, and increased substance abuse are just some of them. And there's also an increase in receiving mental health services as well as mental health diagnosis. Really, and it's really a normative response to everything being intensified, really. And the recipe is really in what everybody wrote in the chat box about where there's a downfall. One further thing to think about, I mean, we're virtual today, and I appreciate that because then we can all be together, but there is a downside to this. MRI data, actually brain scans reveal that live face-to-face interactions are associated with greater activation in the same brain regions as involved in reward. So being live and in person where you can see, feel, taste, touch, smell, all of that, all our senses are very involved in our activation in terms of like our reward system creating dopamine, our serotonin levels are impacted by that. Vasopressin is also another one, the bonding hormone. All of that gets impacted, by being on virtual in the negative, really. So more social connection is related to alertness versus fatigue, right? And direct mutual gaze is affected, which affects trust. So overall, our trust levels have decreased under this. And it's not the kind of trust that's like quantifiable by like, I trust that. It's more like what's called neuroception, that kind of trust. And neuroception is kind of how we sense each other and whether or not something's safe. It's gotten off kilter because of that. It's gotten rusty. Even the masks are impacting as well because we're not having like full on mirror neurons. It's a kind of exchange, which leads to synergy between us, Most communication is unconscious and nonverbal and relies more on social cues, and subtle facial expressions and full body gestures are not captured on video. And that, that's how we interact as human beings. And it actually is a protective factor to spend time with each other. But it's been compromised. And I think if anybody really thinks about it, I'm sure there's people on the call that feel like socially rusty in that. And maybe your read on things isn't as clear or comfortable, particularly people who are shyer, I think kind of like we're okay with some of this initially, but are actually even suffering even more than extroverted people because it kind of like put them behind the 8 ball on that. Did you have something to say, Jeff? Did you want to cut in? You unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out the question from Jody, but it seems like you were addressing that. She was asking about the difference in experiences between introverted and extroverted people.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Person, yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay. So I kind of went there. Yeah, what I can say kind of anecdotally too is my clients initially who were, I had one, who said, I've been preparing for this moment all my life, because they felt like it was going to be a good thing to kind of be home. And I really think that people that struggle with that, it actually was more destabilizing maybe for them than extroverts. I mean, extroverts take it hard, and we'll talk about that. But I think our neuroception really got impacted is the basic answer to that. And people with more sensitivity in terms of that, maybe potentially might suffer harder. And I think anecdotally, I would say that that's it. I don't have a study to say it, but I think so. So let's talk a little bit about bearing witness, other things that we've been bearing witness to over this time, and I want to say that this is impacted obviously by by media sources, that we engage in, and information, which is subject to like kind of like being like looked at whether or not it's a viable source or not. But we know overall there's vast unemployment during that time. There was economic destabilization. There were shutdowns. There's racial injustice linked to 450 years of actual insanity, really, that was coming to a head. I want to be really mindful that it's not something that came up and on. It's just that it's front and center because of video cameras and people paying attention, to this. And so physical distancing from each other, loneliness, social isolation, widespread illness, and life threat. Obviously, if we think just in terms of the COVID-19 virus, that life threat happened in terms of that one breath, and we know that really the only thing between life and death is really that one breath, if we really think about it. And I think that we became very mindful of that. And some of us on the call have suffered losses or might have had a bad case and remembered all of that, but really it was like ambient. That type of stress was something new, I think, in terms of a pandemic, and it was unpredictable, and unpredictability throws us really out of baseline as well, because we don't really know where the bottom is. Then we're recalibrating what is the bottom of this, or what is the end. And people keep saying the finish line keeps moving on this, which is a roller coaster ride as well, and really affects neurochemicals as well. Okay, so I wanted to just show this little graphic of thriving versus at the top, and then resilience in the middle, and the bottom would be surviving. So just in terms of measuring where we are, and of course the goal is always to thrive, is to use all the ingredients in our life, good, bad, or indifferent, to create a state of thriving, where we really feel like, we're moving, and that we're present, and that we can access things that we need, and also grieve, losses and things like that, in a way where we're really present for it. It's not all sunshine, sometimes it's really bearing witness to the pain and suffering that we're feeling, and the powerless maybe that we're feeling, but at least if we can thrive around it, we can engage other systems that people mentioned, and focus on our strengths in a really genuine kind of way. Our interests and our strengths are deeply connected, and that really is what a protective factor for thriving is. But if you're in autonomic survival, you can't really get to the point where you're going to thrive, because your social engagement system gets shut down during that. And sometimes under this, people have to find pockets of being able to do that. Like little pockets of sanity, is what I would say, where can you get some of this, where you actually feel like you're thriving, even if it's 10 minutes a day. But that's not enough, as we know. But I wanted to talk about like some current things, because I was thinking I saw a graphic yesterday, or a picture in the news. It's actually a video. This is from 1989, and we have these like watershed moments that happen that kind of make us really think, what is really going on, and how vulnerable really are we? Because we're really vulnerable as human beings. And so this is a picture of Tiananmen Square, actually, in 1989, and I think of this image a lot, actually, in terms of like people who survive, and build mastery around like very severe traumas, and so this person took on the tanks, and I mean, this is very meaningful to me. I mean, I think I was 1989, I was 20 years old when I saw this on the news, and if anybody remembers, he was taking on the tanks, during a protest where people were actually murdered, and, that to me, he was like defying like being overcome, by this thing that was really, in the largest way we could ever imagine, completely unfair, and really was not going to let him thrive. So basically the response was for him to go into his fight and literally fight the tanks. And there's an extended video. If you haven't seen it, watch it. But I actually saw the same thing relative to the Ukraine. And I don't know if you can see it, but this man took on the tank. He's actually having the tank, like not like he's battling the tank coming to the Ukraine to overpower Ukraine, you know. And it's the same kind of thing. And sometimes I think that that's what makes us feel so demoralized and impacts our resilience is like, it's basically the same thing, different day. And it can be really demoralizing, like when we're not realizing our interconnectivity and learning from history, the impact on like the human spirit overall, you know. And it's easy to separate ourselves from these images because they're thousands of miles away, but the bottom line is we're all getting impacted by that same ripple effect. And our whole very being of freedom and what really feels like freedom, like the ability to be free, like liberation, you know, is impacted by that just by taking in those images, you know. And we may feel powerless. We may curl up in a ball, you know, or we may be, you know, callous and desensitized by it. But the bottom line is we're all, it's entering all of us, these images. And I thought about, when I saw that, I immediately thought about Tenement Square. And I'm like, this is the same stuff, like different day, and the same ridiculous argument, which is who's going to maintain and hold the most power, you know, and that impacts us deeply, is what I'm pointing out. So really, in terms of autonomic survival, you know, even looking at those images can put us into a place, depending on who we are, where we feel reactive to it. Our human nervous system is tuned to detect safety and danger, integrating body and brain responses via the autonomic nervous system. So that's basically our smoke detector, the amygdala. It fires, and the circuitry around our brain either gets heightened in the right or the left. And I'm not going to go into a big neurobiology lesson, but basically our shifts in our brain body states towards danger response can compromise our mental health and our physical health. We know that everything's interconnected. The mind-body connection is a fallacy because it's all connected. I mean, it's just all connected. It's just the connection, you know, and how we connect to each other actually is protective or puts us into the risk, into a risk factor as well. So I have something for us, basically saying, now that I'm kind of saying this is what's happening, let's look at what do we do about this. Now, this is from the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, but this is really a crisis stabilization and safety aid for us as workers. And you can teach this if you're working with client populations that you think might benefit us, but really this graphic is really here for us. So it's basically cueing us to be on the lookout for signals from our nervous system, right? And a lot of times we're moving so fast, we're not even checking in on that. So I want you to remind yourself, you know, accelerated heart rate, this is for upregulators, people who get hyper aroused, because, you know, sometimes we're between those states or we're one or the other predominantly, but people who get the accelerated heart rate, shallow breathing, if you see yourself avoiding social situations or having like erratic thoughts or not clarity in thoughts, racing thoughts, muscle tension, heavy fatigue, rapid speech, numbness, or insomnia, okay? And then really sometimes that high activation gets so high that you'll start to shut down and you'll feel your parasympathetic nervous system kick in to the range where it's too slow, and you're hyper aroused. That's like the dorsal side being, you're just shut down. You feel like you can't move around it. But either way, this acronym will help with that. So the scope safety aid stabilizes physiological stress response and helps build resilience to get through crisis. And this could be just in the moment. The crisis could just be that you're noticing heightened reactivity or hypoarousal to situations, you know. So this is an effective tool for frontline workers, first responders, and people dealing with intense pressure. So the S is for slow down. It really recommends like a little bit of a mindfulness exercise, taking 10 steps very slowly, noticing any sensations on the bottom of your feet. Now, in terms of the feet are very, very grounding. I mean, even just right now, if your feet are on the floor and you think about your big toe and you notice the sensation of your big toe, that can be very grounding. That might be the first time you thought about being in your body at all today. Okay. So if you just use that as an example right now, you just kind of think about your big toe, sensation of the big toe. And if you haven't thought about anything that's going on in your body today, that means probably you're flying by the seat of your pants every day with work and everything else. And that's just a simple little pointing it out. And then C would be connecting to the body. Cross your arms and ankles, tuck hands under the armpits, lower the head and breathe. That's just a simple bilateral stimulation, actually. That's why we cross the arms. So if you do that exercise, you're sending a message to the limbic system that you're trying to calm down. And it has a lot to do with what's called polyvagal theory. And I'm not going to teach that today, but it's something you could look up in terms of why doing that bilateral stimulation can be helpful. Okay, and the breathing is going to connect you to your body and also connect you to the part of your body that knows how to calm down. It also helps with the social engagement system, which is going offline a lot for people. So orienting, that could be just slowly looking around, noticing colors and shapes, naming them in your mind, letting your eye gaze rest on something pleasant or comforting, like a brief visual vacation, because just like those images I show that might make our heart rate go up, thinking about calming imagery actually makes it go down and calms us down and puts us back into the healthy range of the parasympathetic nervous system. So I want to try one more with you all if you're able and willing. Pendulation, that's noticing a place of ease in the body. So if we were going to think right now somewhere where you're really feeling relaxed and calm in the body, and then think of a place of tension, okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to slowly shift attention between ease and tension and ease. So for me, my place of tension is my lower back, and a place of ease is definitely in my feet. So I'm going to switch from back and forth from my feet to my back, feet, back. You can just pick the two places and practice with that. And basically what it does is it really increases your mind-body connection awareness in the body. And then you'll tend to respond differently. It's really amping up the idea of responding to stimuli versus reactivity. And then the last one is engaging socially and connecting with someone who can support you, okay? And that could be your family, it could be friends, it could be, spiritual organization, whatever it is. But one of the biggest protective factors of resiliency is actually social connections. And with pandemic, it has an impact on familial and social rituals for sure. Religious organizations shut down, and you couldn't spend like holidays and time with your family. That was being recommended that you don't, which is all counterintuitive to resiliency. That's where we take respite and refuge is in those types of places. And so if you're thinking also about like developmentally, how it affects children, adolescents, and adults, I'm certainly seeing that. I'm seeing that at the level of where I'm teaching undergraduates, and what being out of school for a couple of years potentially did to their ability to obtain like life experience, essential life experience that would help them, be a social worker or understand, and also protective factors of being, in the human services profession. It's having a lot of impact, and we haven't fully wrapped our head around what the impact is to date. And to some extent, we're acquiescing to what the standard that we set up during this, because it feels maybe easier. And we're still in it. So I don't want to be reckless and say, we all need to gather, in the hundreds and thousands of people. And no, but we do need to feel, see, smell, touch things again. We need to be in like really in vivo, like with each other, in terms of like life experiences, because one of the things that actually, if you were to measure happiness, overall happiness, and this is measured, there's plenty of studies on this, in terms of like what really makes us happy is having just enough of what we need, right? And also having access to experiences that are enhancing, to us, and that was very greatly compromised during this time. And to some point, at some point, we are actually making new default settings that we're accepting this. And that is actually hypoarousal. It's shutting down. So be mindful of that is all I'm saying. Now, in resiliency and engagement relationships, much of our resilience is related to our relationships with other people, our primary attachments, our spiritual relationships, and cultural practices, and the role of learning from each other to endure and recover from challenges. Are there questions, Jeff, that I should be tending to?
Not at the moment, no, but
Okay.
I don't know if you want to, do you want to pause for a second to see if we have questions, or you?
Yeah, I do, because there's actually, let me go through this one last 3 slides, and then I'll open it up, because I want to give a little bit of a formula. So there's a beautiful indigenous epistemology of resilience, and it's called the 4 R's, because it's easy. It's easy to kind of like pay attention to for yourself, for your clients. And these are by Comanche social activist LaDonna Harris. And her recommendations are that the 4 R's of resilience are relationships, right? Kinship, in the most profound sense, we are all related. Paying attention to that, that we're all related. Like I said, the ripple effect that we send out to each other is great, and it never ends, actually. Every action we do, whether positive or negative. So humans are related both to each other and to all things. Responsibility, community to empower our relationships and relatives, not diminish them, right? And reciprocity and interconnectedness, our relationships and responsibilities shape our roles in life and are reciprocal, as is the nature of the universe. And redistribution and generosity, our reciprocal relationships and responsibilities guides us to share our resources to help and maintain balance. The collective and communal traditions of our ancestors teach us that wealth must be shared for the greater good of the whole. And that could just mean even just sharing your time. Okay. There's a big global side of that to think about, how we impact in terms of like our economic systems, but it's also just right down to the very basic idea of sharing time with another human being. That's generosity. It's just really being present in the grief with someone else, or just teaching them a shared like interest, whatever it is. There's something I'm going to do. I'm feeling kind of dull and listless. I got a plot in a community garden. I don't know how to garden. I'm gonna try to figure it out, and then I get to send this really cool ripple effect, which is I get to share food with people, which I think is pretty basic to nurturing, that basic nourishment. All right, so just one last slide on interconnectivity. One last concept, a little deeper. It's called Indras web, or Indras Net. It goes by both. It's an Eastern religious thought in terms of how we are all interconnected, and I like to use visuals, kind of like to bring things down to right size, and I'll leave you with that. And yeah, I got a couple other ones for hope, real quick. The Renaissance came out of a pandemic, just to inspire a little hope. All right. The Harlem Renaissance came out of the 1918 flu. These are great, like, beautiful developments in our society, as well as the Roaring 20s came out of the 1918 influenza. That came out of there too, and that's resilience, in itself, in terms of art. Those are our clues. Is art it's not just economics, it's art, it's music, it's all those kinds of things that get inspired, by these things, and those are healing practices. So I will leave it at that, because I do want to open it up real quick before we get off, and we have about 15 minutes. So if we run out of questions, I'll go back to the content in the slides. But those are just my ideas on resilience for today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie, for that great information. And if anybody has questions that you'd like to ask Jamie, you can raise your hand on the Zoom, and we'll ask you to unmute. Or if you prefer, you can just type your question into the chat, and we can read it on your behalf. So while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, one of the things that you mentioned early in the presentation that really stood out to me, Jamie, You said that resilience is a process, and that was really opening to me, because I tend to think of resilience, especially when I think about my own level of resilience, I tend to think of it as a finite quality, that you either have a certain amount of it or you don't have a certain amount of it. And it never really occurred to me that resilience could be a continuum where you can be more or less resilient at different times. Like, it was much more of a binary consideration to me.
Right. And resilience is non-binary in that you could be functioning quite well in one domain and really having a hard time in another domain. That's all of us. We might be functioning really well at work right now. Most of us are, we're functioning really well, theoretically, that apparent competence kind of thing, but maybe we're falling apart in another area in our life. And so resilience can be cultivated in all those domains, I guess is the simple answer to that. There were a couple people raising hands though, I saw. I don't.
Charlena,
Charlena, yeah.
thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I think about part of the fatigue was that parallel process. So when everything shut down, it affected us as well. And yet I still had a busy schedule. And I just remember that time of being absolutely stunned and in shock and having to still come alongside patients to help them when I didn't even fully understand anything. And I remember that a lot of the fatigue that I was experiencing was the questions, the just the inundation of questions and worry from my beloved patients, and me just not having answers and being just really bewildered rather. And it really was, I didn't realize I had delayed resiliency fatigue until many months later, and had to really, do some deep soul searching and work and prayer. And it's interesting because I have a couple of patients currently who are from the Ukraine. And I found myself, back at that place yesterday trying to provide support. And she's looking to me, help me be able to sleep, give me answers, give me, tips and tools. And I'm thinking, this is horrible. What's happening in your country? And her family are hiding in the basement. And, so she wants, like a quick fix and give her 1, 2, 3 steps. And I had to be honest and say, I can't make you feel better, but we can work through some things to kind of help you be functional. So of course I took it to bed with me last night, woke up thinking about her, called her first thing this morning when she's not even on my calendar. And I said, no, I can't go back to where I was 2 years ago. So I'm definitely going to use the scope for myself. I was actually practicing it as you were teaching it, and we'll definitely use it as a tool to help her as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. And I mean, sometimes we're just bearing witness to what people are going through and just helping them maybe be a little more responsive in the moment to just taking care of the basic things like sleep, appetite, rest, and really acknowledging I don't have an answer. I mean, same thing happened during 9/11. They put us on these telephones. I worked in a medical system and they're like, go man these telephones, and we were all, just as shocked and overwhelmed as, potentially people calling in. People had all kinds of things going on, losing family members, not knowing where their family members were. And as these things come up, sometimes we're just sitting with somebody, we're in the presence of their grief or their fear or their worry. And we don't have to have an answer, it's not accessible, it's still happening. Okay.
Thanks for that question. Do we have any other questions for Jamie? I don't see any other hands at the moment, but that doesn't mean there aren't any.
Okay. So can go back to some of these points. I did have Thich Nhat Hanh, a little quote from him, because we tie resilience to hope. Hope is one of those things that if you have it, right, it does impact neurochemically where we are. That's known, and it protects us. It actually is a protective factor to, responses to trauma. People who have PTSD, actually, even if they have PTSD, their prognosis is better if they have hope, if they have the hope that, they can master the things that have happened to them. And that's one of the points that I would make, is that we don't get over the things necessarily that happen to us as human beings or that are happening around us, but we can build mastery towards learning how to cope, but that doesn't, I want to be really careful that we're not saying we want to help people like adjust to bad or toxic situations, because that's not what we're doing, but we're trying to maintain enough clarity and mindfulness to know how to proceed effectively. And this is a person, who lived through conflict in Vietnam, and his friends were setting themselves on fire, and he was ultimately exiled from his country for his actually peaceful contributions, because they were threatening. Sometimes the more peaceful we are, the more threatening we can be around some things. But anyway, he's qualified to say this. So basically what he's saying is hope, what he said, because Thich Nhat Hanh just passed away recently, but hope is important because it can make the present moment less difficult to bear. If we believe that tomorrow will be better, we can bear a hardship today. And that was in response to him talking about rebuilding a village in Vietnam, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, not 5 times. They rebuilt the village 5 times. And the reason that he said that they made a decision beyond 2 and 3 times to keep rebuilding the village was because he was afraid that it would make people lose hope if they did not keep rebuilding the village, because the village is like a vision that at some point there's going to be safety, and at the same time as, things are falling apart, you'd have to validate that this is really hard and this is not optimal. But also, how do we keep going? Which is a really hard, delicate balance. But that has a lot to do with cultivating resilience in different domains, as we were talking about. I don't know how much time we have left. We have about 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay. So getting back to some more. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, Wilfredo is just saying, very relevant today, what we were just speaking about, being relevant in that as an Iraqi war veteran, he finds it very helpful.
Thank you, Wilfredo. So in terms of some hope, like I said, Renaissance was spawned from a plague, from the plague in the 1300s. The whole Renaissance evolved out of that. I read in a book one time, it said Shakespeare was born of a plague, and the whole idea that there's life after things, major events like this, and inspiration, it's just, how do we stay present enough, not to lose that and have the gray, and the dull, take over. This is another theme from the Indras web. And that's just the sense, that's a spiritual idea of how we are all interconnected, throughout the universe. Now, the thing about that is, if anyone's ever studied physics or fractals, and you think of the idea of a snowflake, right? And how it's like kind of infinite and never ending. If you look at anything hard enough, you see how infinite it is, so that also is the resilience of just everything around us, like atomically and cellularly, and those interconnections, are super important because they're unavoidable. We can draw the boundaries that we want, and we can label things as much as we care to, but the bottom line is it doesn't separate us, and we are all interacting with each other. And so we can move through things effectively and responsively, or we can react and everything kind of gets detonated. And that's really what causes resistance versus resilience, is really, a lot of times we interpret information in a way where it seems beneficial, but it's harmful. I mean, you think like Darwin, right? What was Darwin's biggest thing that people study was survival of the fittest, right? Which was exclusionary, which basically said you only made it if you were a certain way. But really what came before that, he had a different theory that was like kind of pushed into the background, and that was of cooperation. So if you think about geese, right? And how geese fly in a V, and the reason they fly in a V is to make it easier on the geese in the back, and they keep switching formation, right? So there's less running up that hill with the boulder for the geese. You know, they're able to fly in formation. And the thing about geese is if one gets sick, one lands with the other one and hangs out with it until it feels better, you know? And as human beings, like that was the more prevalent like theory that Charles Darwin had, was of cooperation, you know? And how do we get people to kind of just slow down and pay attention, you know, when multitasking is revered, and you know, busy schedules are revered, and power is revered, and all the things that are revered in our culture, you know, where there's so much more underlying, you know, that builds resilience. People think that vulnerability makes us fragile, and it actually puts steel in our spine, you know, is my point. Because if you think about the vulnerability of all living things and how they're interconnected, that's what grounds us in our resilience, is that, you know, we're not alone, you know, it's not insular, and we're not isolated, you know. And that's probably my last slide. Yeah.
So I have two questions. One, my question is, if people are interested in learning more about Indras Net or Indras Web, is there a good website they can go to? I did a quick Google search, but I'm not sure.
I mean, it's an Eastern religious concept. I mean, there's a couple good videos on YouTube. There's one in particular, I think, I don't remember the name of it, honestly, Jeff. It's just like a concept that I like to say, because it's an age old, I like to give like all different perspectives. And that's one perspective that actually aligns with physics. You know, it actually does. You can go into that for a long time, and you're not going to come out of that one the same. I must give that, and I think it's a good thing. But yeah, Jeff, I don't have it's a Eastern philosophical thought process that's also aligned with.
Well, I did find one that I can share for anybody who's interested, just in some basic information, and then you can all travel off in other directions if this sparked your interest. So here's what I was able to find with a quick Google search. And then also we had a question from Nadine, just wondering if you think that pointing out silver linings to people when trying to find hope is something about pointing about silver linings. Is that something that could offend people who are in crisis and maybe can't see that at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, silver linings, I wouldn't say that. I think validating that people are going through things, right? And that they may be feeling really powerless, and that they haven't come out the other side of it yet, is probably a better practice. It's not about that. That can be really invalidating, actually. And a silver lining actually should be discovered by the person. You know, that's kind of like for them to decide whether or not they have. But they're going to grow through it either way. It's just they determine what growth happens through something like that. I hope it answers your question. I think validation is more important, and saying, look, I'm going to be here through this with you, you know. And you are feeling powerless, and you're not out the other side. Where we deal with trauma as past, I can certainly say to my clients, one of the things I want you to be able to say to yourself is that already happened. That already happened. Just remind yourself that already happened, and that was temporary, and your post-traumatic stress around it is still in your cells, but that already happened. If someone's still going through it, we can't really say that because they haven't come through it, they haven't mastered it. And that's where maybe that sentence saying, like, you know, you might not get over this, but you know, you're going to learn ways to master having this have happened in your life. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Jamie. And I guess one last question to wrap up, and it's a good one. Deb is asking, people have expressed frustration recently on different Facebook groups that we only are talking about individuals and our responsibility to do self-care or be resilient without talking about the larger system and addressing the deficits and importance of change in the larger system as well. How can we address both?
It's a really large question, and certainly, yes, the systemic violence of larger systems and disparities we do have to validate that. How do we address it is we pick a way that we're going to work on that, and we manifest it. I mean, whether it's voting rights or advocating or testifying. I mean, social work's political. It's the big P, it's the little p. You know, self-care is it's a age-old thing prior to, you know, it's 2,500 years old. A lot of the concepts that we tout as self-care now, it's also cultivated, from areas of oppression. Actually, true self-care, is caring and nurturing in terms of like a village or a tribal mentality versus an individual mentality. It's not meant for just individual. It's meant to exceed that, that we balance ourselves and then we offer help and we share and cultivate all the ways that I spoke of before in terms of those 4 R's. But I think acknowledging that the systems that be don't make it optimal for everybody or accessible for everybody, and picking a point of where we're going to operate from. I mean, my small new thing is going to be, I'm going to garden and I'm going to donate that food. It's 2 plots. One's for me and whoever I choose. The other one is allotted for a food bank or wherever you have to donate an entire plot. I mean, whatever it is, it seems like a small thing. It probably is in the grand scheme of things, but that's the thing I'm picking this summer. That and voting rights. I need to mention voting rights because that's one of the things that I'm concerned about is voter suppression. And there's, but we can't do that stuff unless we're fortified.
Yeah, and there's certainly no shortage of areas where social workers can get involved, pushing back on systems that are oppressive or are not functioning well. I mean, NASW New Jersey for the last several years has been working around the issue of family leave and getting states and businesses to provide family leave for folks, because if you can't take care of your family, you're not going to be able to focus on work when they're ill. We're working to address issues with student loan debt, because when you've got $60,000, $80,000 crushing dollars of student loan debt, and you're dropping a mortgage payment a month on student loan debt, you can't continue to do your work. So there's so many areas that we can push back on when systems are holding us down.
Absolutely.
So anyway, we are at 1:30 and I'd like to be respectful of people's time. So I want to take a moment to thank Jamie so much for this presentation.
Thank you.
Appropriate and really interesting. I think we're all going to take scope back with us to try with ourselves and with our clients. So we will be following up with an email probably within the next day or two that will have a link to the recording of this presentation on YouTube, as well as access to Jamie's slides and any other information that she might want to share. So again, I remind you, for those who may be interested in polyvagal theory, we are having a 3 CEU event this Friday, I think from 9 to 12, an introduction to polyvagal theory, which you're welcome for. And we will be back within the next week or two with a conversation. Thanks so much, everybody, and happy.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.